The pounding on our door came at sunrisey loud, insistent, and ridiculous for what it was about. A flower pot, flashlights sliced through the blinds, beams sweeping across the living room until they landed on my grandfather. He sat stiffly in his wheelchair, hands trembling, but his gaze steady and unyielding. I quietly hit record on my phone. The door rattled under their fists. Behind the officers stood Karen, our Hope president, gripping a citation like it was a battle order. I sent one text, "Come home now." Minutes later, the crunch of tires on gravel filled the air like a warning. Two men climbed out of a truck, their steps deliberate, their expressions unreadable. The home members began edging backward. Even the cops faltered. They had no clue they'd called the wrong family. "Where are you watching this from? Let me know if your hoe has ever tried something this absurd," because what happened that morning was only the opening move in a much bigger fight. To understand how it all began, I need to rewind. My name's Alex Murphy. I live with my grandfather, Walter, in Maple Ridge, a quiet, cookie-cutter neighborhood where drama usually means a trash bin left out too long or a mailbox painted the wrong shade of blue. Grandpa is 78, a Vietnam veteran, and a retired high school principal. Since a stroke put him in a wheelchair 3 years ago, he wears his old Navy jacket when he wants to remind the world he's still not a man to be underestimated. Our neighborhood is run by the Homeowners Association, presided over by none other than Karen Whitfield. Karen treats the HO guidelines as if they were sacred law, and she enforces them with the zeal of someone whose unfulfilled real estate career left her hungry for authority. She's the kind of person who actually measures grass with a ruler and celebrates catching someone's Christmas lights up 2 days too long. The whole mess began with one flower pot, not just any pot, but a large terracotta planter that holds the sunflowers my grandfather planted in memory of my grandmother, Margaret. Those flowers are more than decoration, they're his connection to her, his daily routine, his way of staying grounded after the stroke. Every morning, he wheels himself out to check on them, talking to the blooms as though he's still talking to her, slipping in bits of neighborhood gossip and muttering about the latest nonsense the hoe has cooked up. 2 weeks earlier, Karen had launched what she proudly called her Community Enhancement Initiative. Translation: she walked around with a clipboard and tape measure, hunting for violations to justify her role. Most neighbors sighed, paid their fines, and made quick fixes. Karen thrived on that compliance. She probably thought an elderly man in a wheelchair would be even easier to push around. What she didn't realize was that Walter Murphy had two sons, my uncles, Jake and Ryan, men who lived by loyalty and action, twins who enlisted together 18 years ago, now Navy SEALs with over a decade of service. They were the kind of men who approached problems with relentless focus and absolute resolve. On the morning of the so-called incident, I didn't wake up to the pounding on the door. I woke to the sound of Grandpa maneuvering his wheelchair with unusual urgency. By the time I reached the living room, he was stationed near the front window, Navy jacket over his pajamas, eyes locked on the scene outside like a soldier assessing a battlefield. 2 officers stood on the porch. Officer Martinez read from a complaint about our planter, describing it as an oversized hazard to the community. Behind them, Karen loomed with her clipboard pressed to her chest, measuring tape dangling like a weapon on her belt. She looked positively thrilled, as though calling in law enforcement over a flower pot cemented her authority. The citation claimed our planter exceeded the new 18-inch diameter limit Karen had written into the HO rules. The fine, $500, plus immediate removal. She grinned while snapping photos of her victory, clearly savoring the power trip. I stared at that citation, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't about a flower pot. It was about dignity, respect, and refusing to let someone abuse petty authority to bully people, especially my grandfather. That's when I sent the message that would change everything. Come home now. I didn't know if Jake and Ryan would even see it, but when Karen smiled, gloating as though she'd just won, I sensed this wasn't going to stay a neighborhood squabble. It was going to escalate, and faster than any of us expected. When the police left and Karen retreated to her house, I spent the rest of the morning combing through the HO bylaws. What I found made my blood boil, the kind of fury I hadn't felt since law school when I first learned how many systems are designed to be abused. The so-called planter rule that sparked the police showing up at our door wasn't some long-standing policy we had overlooked. It was a freshly minted bylaw, passed just 2 weeks earlier in what the official meeting minutes delicately described as a special session. Only 3 out of the 15 board members were present to nowhere near a legitimate quorum. The timing was far too neat. Karen had begun her obsessive measuring campaign right around the same time this mysterious regulation appeared in the handbook. When I cross-checked violation reports with neighborhood addresses, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every single citation under the new rule targeted houses in our section of Maple Reggio, the original, older part of the community where families had nurtured their gardens for decades. It was as though Karen was waging war on the parts of the neighborhood that carried history, individuality, and roots, in favor of her sterile, copy-paste vision of suburbia. Grandpa studied the stack of papers I'd printed out, glasses sliding down his nose, his wheelchair pulled close to the kitchen table. He examined the documents with the same precision he once used on lesson plans and the tactical sharpness that had kept him alive in Vietnam. "This isn't random," he said finally, his finger tapping the map I'd sketched out with violations marked in red. "She's running a coordinated campaign. In the military, we'd call this a controlled operation, a territorial, deliberate." The question iced a broken bar. What's her objective? Then he told me about the sunflowers. That truly told me, in a way he hadn't since Grandma Margaret's funeral. They weren't just her favorite flower because of their brightness, they had been in her wedding bouquet when she married him, a young sailor about to deploy. She had planted them in every base housing garden during his 20 years of service. Even while she was sick, she insisted on growing them so that when he returned from his last deployment, beauty would be waiting for him. "Those flowers represent 53 years of marriage," he said, voice low but steady. "They're a promise I made you to keep her memory alive. No clipboard warrior with a measuring tape is taking that from me." I watched his hands tremble, not from his stroke, but from the sheer weight of love and loss behind his words. That's when it hit me. This fight wasn't just about bylaws, property values, or even resisting a bully. It was about memory, devotion, and the right to honor the people who shaped our lives in whatever way gave us peace. While I was still processing his words, a soft knock came at the kitchen window. Mrs. Chen from next door stood outside, clutching a plate of dumplings, eyes darting nervously as though Karen might jump out of the shadows. I let her in through the back door. "She made me take down my prayer flags," she whispered. Her voice shook as though even saying it might bring trouble. "Said they didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic." Her flags had hung in her yard for 15 years, bright symbols of her Buddhist faith that never bothered a Soula until Karen decided they didn't fit her idea of conformity. "She made me feel ashamed of my heritage," Mrs. Chen said, tears welling in her eyes. That landed hard. Karen wasn't just being petty anymore. She was targeting cultural identity, something that could easily cross into discrimination. Her so-called community consistency sounded less like neighborhood policy and more like an outdated, exclusionary covenant from another era. And she wasn't stopping there. By midday, glossy flyers were left on every doorstep in our section. The headline screamed, "Safety alert: oversized planters create hazards for children and the disabled." The irony of using concern for the disabled to attack a disabled veteran was almost too much to stomach. Brad Thompson, a Karen's reluctant sidekick, was the one delivering them door to door. His body language screamed discomfort. When he handed me ours, he wouldn't even meet Grandpa's eyes. "Just doing what Karen asked at a Broken Bar community outreach, you know?" he muttered. Brad was clearly being used, trapped by his own past violations and Karen's threats. Still, the scope of her plan became even clearer when I dug deeper. A request to the county planning office revealed that Karen had commissioned professional property surveys of every house in our section, measurements, diagrams, notes far beyond what any president should need. She'd been preparing for months, building a case against families she saw as obstacles to her vision of Maple Ridge. When I called Jake to tell him what I found, his response was short but certain: "She's not just after Grandpa. She's going after everyone." There was a long silence. I could almost hear gears turning as he processed. Then his voice came calm and steady, the voice of someone who'd handled real threats but understood that family came first. "Ryan and I are 6 hours out. Don't make a move until we get there." He paused, then added, "But don't think for a second Karen's waiting either." That night, As I sat awake combing through more bylaws, I heard the low rumble of an engine outside, a deep growl rolling through the stillness, like thunder crawling over the ground. I pulled back the curtain just in time to see a black pickup pull into our drive. Two identical silhouettes stepped out into the night. The two men who stepped from the truck moved in unison, their pace steady, deliberate, and unmistakably shaped by years of discipline. Even under the soft glow of the porch light, it was obvious that Jake and Ryan carried themselves like men who knew how to control any ground they stood on. Their shoulders relaxed, but their eyes constantly scanning, their awareness automatic and practiced. At 32, they still looked a few years younger, though their weathered faces and lean frames spoke of lives spent outdoors and in demanding situations. Dressed in jeans and dark shirts, they might have looked like any other visitors to the neighborhood, but the confidence in their movements revealed the truth. These weren't ordinary men. When they reached the door, there was no hurry, no dramatic entrance, just 3 light knocks from Jake, calm, measured, yet somehow carrying the weight of command. When I let them in, it felt as though the room itself shifted. They didn't take up much physical space, but their presence filled it anyway. Grandpa Walter wheeled forward to greet them, still wearing his navy jacket like armor. The reunion was brief, stripped of ceremony, yet powerful. It was the kind of connection that required no words, just recognition. "Dad," Jake said, his tone steady, direct. It wasn't small talk, it was a statement. "We're here, and we're handling this." Being the elder twin by 3 minutes, Jake naturally spoke for both. "Show us the paperwork." Ryan drifted toward the window, scanning the street with precise attention, while Jake flipped through the citation and documents I had gathered. "Tell us everything, Alex," Ryan said without turning away from his post. His voice was softer, but carried the same certainty. He wasn't just asking for details, he was collecting intelligence. As I walked them through what had happened to Karen's bylaw trick, the police showing up, her pattern of harassment, if they absorbed every word, nothing I said seemed too small to matter. Jake finished his review quickly. "This bylaw is void," he stated flatly, pointing to the signature page. 3 votes isn't quorum. That makes it unenforceable under state whole law. Ryan, still by the window, added his own observation. "She's rattled," he murmured. Across the street, a light had flicked on in Karen's home office, "but she's planning her next move." It was then Grandpa dropped a revelation he'd been keeping close. "Boys," he said, his tone tinged with the guilt of someone who'd downplayed his hand, "I didn't tell Alex you were SEALs. Wanted to see if I could handle this myself." The silence that followed was heavy. My brain scrambled to process what I just heard. SEALs, my uncles, the guys who used to sneak me candy at family gatherings, or were elite operators? My jaw practically hit the floor. "The broken bar what? SEALs?" I stammered, staring at them as though seeing them for the first time. The timing couldn't have been worse for Karen. She was standing at her window across the street, binoculars pressed to her face, watching our late-night meeting like some backyard spy. She couldn't have missed the word SEALs. Ryan caught her movement instantly. "She heard," he said, his voice even, but edged with finality. "Game's changed." Jake didn't waste a second. He pulled out his phone, speaking in clipped, efficient calls that ranged from lawyers specializing in governance to veterans' rights advocates. His tone left no room for dismissal. "Yes, I need a consultation on enforcement law tonight." Meanwhile, Ryan slipped outside, pacing the perimeter with the quiet precision of reconnaissance, studying sight lines, entry points, and angles of observation. To anyone else, this was a neighborhood squabble. To them, it was a tactical problem to be mapped and solved. Within 30 minutes, the entire conflict had transformed. This was no longer about a plantra, it was a battlefield of authority, pride, and law. And Karen had just learned she wasn't facing an elderly man and his grandson anymore. She was staring down a family reinforced by men trained not to flinch under pressure. Most people, upon realizing they'd gone head-to-head with Navy SEALs, would have backed off immediately. But Karen wasn't most people. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. It was as if admitting defeat was more dangerous to her ego than escalating against men who'd faced real wars. By sunrise, she'd already taken her fight to the public stage. She called Channel 7 News, spinning a narrative in which she was the victim. According to Karen, peaceful volunteers of the Ho were being intimidated by military tactics in their own suburban neighborhood, and the producer on the other end of the line, intrigued enough to start asking questions. The mix of military connections and neighborhood drama caught the attention of Channel 7, and they agreed to send a reporter for a preliminary interview later that day. By then, Brad Thompson had unwillingly shifted roles from passing out flyers to acting as Karen's makeshift PR assistant. It was clear he wasn't comfortable with the job. When he came by our house around noon, supposedly to give us a courtesy notice about the news coverage, every part of his posture screamed hesitation. He couldn't even look Grandpa Walter in the eye as he rattled off Karen's reasoning, claiming she only wanted to make sure the media got both sides of the story. His voice, though, betrayed the fact that he knew Karen's version was anything but balanced. "Mr. Murphy," Brad muttered nervously, clutching a folder filled with talking points that were clearly written by Karen. "This is just standard Ho procedure. Mrs. Whitfield feels that community safety concerns should be aired properly, and if that means media involvement, then so be it." The way he said it sounded more like someone reciting a script than speaking from conviction. While Karen polished her narrative for the cameras, Jake and Ryan set about peeling back the layers of her history. Ryan worked the neighborhood in his usual understated way, striking up casual conversations that quickly turned into residents sharing stories they hadn't told before. Piece by piece, a disturbing pattern emerged. Karen had been systematically targeting families for more than 2 years. Her victims included at least 8 households, each hit with arbitrary citations, strange inspections, or outright intimidation. Meanwhile, Jake dug into the paperwork. Where Ryan collected personal accounts, Jake uncovered the trail of documents that exposed the machinery behind Karen's campaign. He found records showing Ho funds being used to pay for property surveys are the same ones I'd stumbled across, proving Karen was funneling community money into her personal battles. He also spotted signs of selective enforcement, where only certain families were ever called out for supposed violations. The victims all had something in common. They didn't fit Karen's rigid image of a proper suburban community. The Chen family's prayer flags, the Rodriguez kids' lemonade stand, Mr. Johnson's antique car project, and of course, our memorial sunflowers all had one thing in common. They represented individuality, which Karen seemed determined to stamp out. The real breakthrough came when Ryan visited Mr. Johnson, an elderly widower who'd spent 18 months carefully documenting every run-in he'd had with Karen. A retired accountant, Johnson had kept notes with meticulous precision, dates, times, exact quotes, even sketches of where and how Karen conducted her infamous measurements. His notebook didn't read like casual complaints, it looked more like a legal case file, building toward evidence of harassment. Back at our kitchen table, Ryan laid the notebook out for Jake and Grandpa Walter. "She's not enforcing rules," he said grimly. "She's running a campaign to control anyone who challenges her." Walter listened with the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were finally confirmed. That same afternoon, Karen sat down for her big interview with Channel 7. She came prepared with talking points designed to paint us as dangerous, describing the Murphy family as intimidating and framing the presence of military veterans in the neighborhood as a supposed safety concern. But Sarah Martinez, the reporter assigned to the story, wasn't buying it. A seasoned journalist with a sharp eye for spin, Martinez pressed Karen on specifics. When Karen was asked to explain the timeline of events, she had to admit that police were first called over a flower pot, one that violated newly amended bylaws passed just 2 weeks earlier. Martinez didn't stop there, pressing her on quorum rules, inconsistent enforcement, and why the same families kept turning up in complaints. Slowly but surely, Karen's carefully rehearsed narrative unraveled, leaving her looking less like a concerned community leader and more like a petty bully abusing her power. Jake's legal contacts had been working in parallel, and their findings were even more damning. What Karen had been doing wasn't just unfair, it might actually be unlawful. Misusing Ho authority to pursue personal vendettas could be considered an abuse of power, particularly since her actions disproportionately targeted veterans and ethnic minorities. Combined with the financial irregularities Jake had found, it painted a picture of misconduct that could expose Karen to civil liability, removal from office, or worse. By the time Jake labeled the next step phase 2 of our response, it was obvious this was no longer a simple host squabble. Karen had escalated it into a public war, and now she was facing a family fully capable of meeting her challenge head-on. Her reaction to the disastrous interview was telling. She immediately called an emergency home meeting for the following evening. The move itself violated the association's own bylaws, which required 72 hours notice, but Karen either didn't care or thought she was above the rules. The vague agenda she distributed mentioned only safety concerns and enforcement procedures, but everyone knew the real purpose: to try and salvage her crumbling reputation and hold on to power. To make matters worse, she extended an official invitation to Officer Martinez, hoping to use his presence as an endorsement of her authority. Martinez called our house before the meeting, clearly uneasy about the role Karen had roped him into. His voice carried the tone of someone who realized too late that he'd been turned into a pawn in her campaign. The fact that he reached out to warn us about what Karen expected him to say showed that his loyalty was more to fairness than to her agenda. When Jake spoke with him directly, Martinez admitted he'd never seen an whole situation escalate to the point where police involvement was necessary, and he seemed genuinely baffled about why Karen refused to resolve things through standard administrative channels. Jake and Ryan, on the other hand, treated preparation for the meeting like a mission. Their planning combined legal research, outreach to neighbors, and careful coordination that transformed what could have been a shouting match into a controlled presentation of facts. Jake spent hours consulting a lawyer who specialized in veterans' housing rights, uncovering that selective enforcement of home rules against military families could fall under state and federal protections. What seemed like a neighborhood squabble now carried the weight of potential legal action, with serious consequences for Karen if her pattern of targeting residents was proven. Ryan's quiet conversations with neighbors uncovered frustrations that had been simmering for months. People who had previously kept their heads down were now ready to speak. Mrs. Chen, who had endured threats over her cultural decorations, agreed to present photos of the prayer flags she'd been forced to take down along with the intimidating letters she'd received. The Rodriguez family committed to showing up with their kids, and not only to defend their children's lemonade stand but also to prove that families could stand together against intimidation. The most shocking turn came when Mrs. Whitmore, one of Karen's staunch allies, confided to Mrs. Chen that Karen had promised to erase her overdue HO fees in exchange for voting against us. The elderly widow had accepted out of desperation, but guilt gnawed at her. She now realized she had been manipulated into helping harass a disabled veteran. Her willingness to come forward provided direct evidence of vote tampering that could undermine Karen's control over the board. Meanwhile, Alex had pulled everything together into what he called the evidence portfolio. It was a thick binder of documents, official letters, financial records, testimonies, and a timeline of harassment that showed a clear escalation from petty rule citations to serious attempts at intimidation. Among the most damaging findings was proof that Karen had used HO funds to pay for professional surveys, which were then weaponized against specific residents. Further digging into the financials hinted at something worse than simple mismanagement, a potential fraud or embezzlement. Several expenses Karen had approved appeared to benefit her private real estate consulting work rather than the community, leaving a paper trail that tied personal profit to her role as HO president. By the time the community center filled up, it was clear this wasn't going to be a routine meeting. Nearly 50 residents crowded into a space normally occupied by fewer than 20. Karen strode in with her usual clipboard and a forced air of authority, but her nervous movements betrayed that she knew how much was at stake. Martinez followed reluctantly, the picture of a man who wished he were anywhere else but determined to fulfill his duties. Walter positioned himself at the front with Alex and the portfolio, ready to present the evidence. Jake and Ryan stayed toward the back, watchful but calm, blending in with the crowd while still radiating the quiet confidence of men used to handling far more serious confrontations. When Karen called the meeting to order and announced that the session would focus on critical security issues within the neighborhood, the mood shifted instantly. The residents leaned in, no longer curious spectators but participants waiting to see whether this night would finally tip the balance of power. No one could have predicted just how pivotal this meeting would become. It wasn't only about whole leadership anymore, it was about the very character of the neighborhood itself. So, what could Karen have done differently to prevent everything from reaching this boiling point? I'm Jason Miller, writing from Chicago, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think there were red flags she ignored? Or was this clash inevitable once she decided to go after the wrong family? Let me know what you think, and stick around to see how things unfolded once the confrontation turned serious. Karen began the meeting with what she must have believed was a strong, persuasive presentation, but instead, it became a masterclass in how to lose credibility while convince you're winning people over. She'd put together a PowerPoint full of dramatic transitions and carefully chosen photographs, all meant to illustrate what she described as severe security concerns in the neighborhood. Her opening slide showed a picture of Jake and Ryan in our driveway I snapped from her upstairs window with what looked like a telephoto lens. The caption beneath labeled them as unknown military personnel conducting surveillance in residential zones. Somehow, Karen seemed oblivious to the irony of accusing others of surveillance while literally presenting photos she had taken while spying on her neighbors. From there, her narrative spiraled into exaggeration. She painted Jake and Ryan as intimidating figures, trained military operatives harassing peaceful Ho volunteers, supposedly leveraging their specialized skills to sidestep legitimate oversight. According to her, even our response to a simple flower pot citation was an escalation that endangered the safety of the entire community, especially families with children who might feel threatened by the presence of what she theatrically called special operations personnel. Her slides were littered with phrases about protecting the neighborhood and preserving civilian authority, as though this wasn't about Ho citations at all but about resisting some kind of military occupation. When she introduced Officer Martinez as her expert witness, it was clear she expected him to validate her security claims. But from the moment he began speaking, his discomfort was obvious. Instead of backing her up, his comments were cautious and neutral. Yes, he'd responded to a complaint, but no laws had been broken, and no threats had ever been made. His reluctance to lend weight to Karen's story only underscored how flimsy her case really was. Then Jake stood up. His calm, respectful request to address the room caught Karen off guard. She'd structured the agenda to prevent challenges, assuming no one would dare speak up during such a formal proceeding. But Jake's professional tone forced her to allow it. Refusing would have made her look blatantly biased. What followed was devastating in its simplicity. Jake outlined 3 clear points. The emergency bylaw Karen had invoked wasn't valid without the required quorum. The 24-hour meeting notice violated the Ho's own rules, and her selective enforcement of regulation suggested possible discrimination against protected groups. He went on to explain how Ho's are legally bound to follow their own policies, that emergency measures can only be applied in specific circumstances, and that abusing official power for personal vendettas could actually be unlawful. When Jake highlighted that Officer Martinez had no authority to enforce Ho rules without a court order, the visible relief on the officer's face was undeniably, and everyone in the room noticed. Next came Alex, who presented the evidence portfolio. His organized collection of documents shifted the tone of the meeting from a spectacle of accusations into something resembling a courtroom. His timeline laid out a clear progression of Karen's harassment, starting with trivial citations and escalating into more aggressive attempts to control residents. Public records he'd obtained revealed that Karen had been funneling home money into professional surveys, a tool she then used exclusively to target neighbors she didn't like. But it was the community testimony that finally tore apart Karen's carefully spun narrative. Mrs. Chen's soft-spoken account of being forced to remove her prayer flags was particularly powerful. Her quiet dignity, paired with photos of decorations that had peacefully hung in her yard for 15 years, made it impossible to dismiss her experience as exaggeration. Then came Mr. Rodriguez, who'd brought his children with him. Their presence made Karen's earlier accusations sound absurd. As he read from the citation that described his kids' lemonade stand as an unauthorized commercial enterprise creating zoning violations, several residents actually laughed. Seeing an 80-year-old and her little brother flipping through coloring books in the meeting room only emphasized the ridiculousness of Karen's actions. The most damaging testimony, though, came from Mr. Johnson. For a year and a half, He had kept a meticulous log of his interactions with Karen, including direct quotes that revealed her true intentions. His records captured her openly saying certain residents needed to be taught a lesson or that she wanted to make examples out of those who resisted her rules. With dates, times, and exact wording, his documentation left no room for Karen to claim misunderstanding or exaggeration. By the time he finished reading, the weight of evidence against Karen was undeniable. The log of painted a picture of consistent abuse of power rather than fair enforcement of neighborhood rules. The real turning point came when Mrs. Whitmore, clearly shaken by guilt, rose to admit her involvement. She revealed that Karen had offered to erase her overdue HO fees in exchange for her support during the vote against our family. This confession not only exposed blatant vote manipulation but also destroyed any credibility Karen still claimed about acting in the community's best interest. The frail widow's obvious regret stirred compassion from her neighbors, while at the same time highlighting just how far Karen was willing to go to maintain control. Karen's polished composure crumbled almost instantly. Her frustration spilled over, showing the anger that had fueled her campaign all along. When asked why she selectively targeted certain households while overlooking the same violations among her allies, she snapped that strong leadership meant consistent enforcement for the sake of property values. When pressed on Mrs. Whitmore's testimony, Karen tried to justify her actions by calling it financial assistance for struggling residents. No one in the room believed her. The final blow came when she dismissed Grandpa Walter's military service as irrelevant, saying his status as a veteran didn't entitle him to special treatment or an exemption from the rules. The room went silent. The disrespect she showed to a disabled veteran harassed over flowers planted in memory of his late wife was the breaking point. Whatever little support she had left vanished in that moment. The emergency vote was swift and decisive. Karen was removed from her position as HO president by a vote of 41-4. Only Brad Thompson and two new residents who didn't yet understand the full story sided with her. Every harassment-related fine from the past year was overturned unanimously, and a new oversight committee was formed to prevent abuse of power in the future. As Karen collected her papers and left the meeting she had called to strengthen her authority, the entire atmosphere shifted. Tension gave way to collective relief. It was as though the neighborhood had finally woken from a long nightmare. Have you ever attended a community meeting that turned out this dramatic? I'm Jason Miller, writing from Chicago, and I'd love to hear your stories. Share the most intense HO or neighborhood disputes you've witnessed in the comments below. The last chapter of this saga is just ahead, and you won't believe how it ends. The hours after Karen's ousting felt like a neighborhood breathing freely for the first time in years. Almost immediately, residents who had quietly endured her harassment began sharing stories, revealing the true extent of her campaign to force conformity. The community Facebook group, once tightly censored by Karina, suddenly overflowed with posts of relief, gratitude, and long-suppressed frustrations. Mrs. Chen was the first to take action, proudly reinstalling her vibrant prayer flags the very next morning. Neighbors joined her, turning the moment into a joyful celebration of cultural freedom. That weekend, the Rodriguez children reopened their lemonade stand, this time with official HO approval and a line of neighbors eager to support them. Mr. Johnson once again parked his vintage 1965 Mustang in the driveway, the sight of the restored convertible becoming a symbol of the community's return to sanity. The legal consequences for Karen began to surface faster than expected. Investigators from the state attorney general's office soon arrived, armed with a growing list of complaints about HO abuse in the region. Jake's careful documentation of financial irregularities triggered an audit that uncovered misused funds, including payments to Karen's own consulting firm disguised as HO expenses. The investigation widened to her selective enforcement harassment practices, especially her targeting of veterans and minority-friendly actions that could potentially violate federal housing laws. Meanwhile, Ryan and Jake stayed longer to help Grandpa Walter embrace a new role as a community elder. Together, they designed accessible raised garden beds that served both as a tribute to Grandma Margaret and as a teaching space for children interested in gardening. What began as a personal memorial quickly grew into a neighborhood gathering place, a symbol of unity in direct opposition to the rigid control Karen had tried to enforce. Media coverage of the story spread quickly. Walter's experiences gained attention from veteran organizations and community advocacy groups. Local news outlets ran follow-up stories featuring residents' accounts of harassment, building a narrative of how a neighborhood had come together to resist authoritarian overreach. Walter was soon invited to speak at a state hearing on Ho reform, where his quiet dignity and clear testimony helped build support for stronger protections for homeowners. Even Brad Thompson, once one of Karen's strongest allies, publicly apologized. He acknowledged his role in enabling her behavior and committed to making amends. By joining the Community Garden Project and working with Mrs. Chen to better understand her cultural traditions, he slowly rebuilt trust and became a strong advocate for the new Oversight Committee. His transformation showed that redemption was possible through accountability and genuine change. The next twist came in the form of an official letter. Walter was formally invited to testify before a state legislative committee reviewing a comprehensive Ho reform bill. The proposal, which had stalled for months, suddenly gained momentum as news of our neighborhood's struggle spread across the state. As word spread, other neighborhoods began coming forward with their own accounts of Ho abuse and overreach. Walter's case quickly became a reference point in discussions about stronger protections of proposals that would rein in unchecked Ho authority and require accountability from community leaders who misused their power. That evening, I watched my grandfather roll onto the porch, the fading sunlight glinting off his Navy service pins while the sunflowers he had planted for Margaret swayed softly in the breeze. It struck me they knew what had begun as a conflict over a single flower pot had grown into something far greater than any of us imagined. The community garden had become a flourishing symbol of renewal, filled with vegetables and flowers from the many cultures in our neighborhood. Children played freely again without fear of citations for simply being kids. And neighbors who once avoided one another now shared laughter and conversation instead of silently enduring arbitrary rules. But our story wasn't finished. Jake handed Walter the legislative invitation with a knowing smile. "Dad," he said, "looks like your flower pot sparked more than neighborhood justice." He was right. What had begun as a personal stand had grown into a movement, a fight for fairness, respect, and community over control and intimidation. And Walter Murphy, of all people, had become its most unlikely yet perfect champion. If you've ever felt powerless against petty bureaucrats or neighborhood bullies, you know exactly what Walter went through. At Ya Stories, we believe every person deserves dignity and fairness, no matter how small the issue may seem. Walter's determination proved that standing up makes a difference, especially when backed by unity and the right approach. If you believe neighborhoods should lift each other up instead of tearing one another down, give this story a like, and subscribe to JA Stories for more real accounts of ordinary people finding extraordinary strength when it matters most. From all of us here at Ya Stories, thank you for watching Resetting the Ho Overlord. We'll be back soon with more tales of neighborhood power struggles, property disputes, and unexpected resilience. Until then, take care of your community, and yes, even keep those ducks in a row.